Welcome to the PowerPoint on romantic partnerships in later life. In this lecture, I'm going to mainly summarize and kind of highlight some of the key findings from Karen Unz's Decade Review article that we read, specifically related to romantic partnerships. And I'll add in some additional information as we go. So before we get into specific content, I just want to give you a heads up that I thought in reading Karen Unz that there were two kind of overarching themes. One was about gender difference, and I don't tend to exaggerate or overfocus on gender differences like we talked about the very beginning of the semester. But there do seem to be some gendered phenomenon happening related to romantic relationships, especially during older age, that's really worth highlighting. And then this idea of interdependence from family systems theory, that we are all affected by each other. So what's happening with other people in our close relationships is going to influence our well-being and vice versa. The concept of interdependence is pretty synonymous with the theoretical concept of linked lives from the life course perspective. So Karen Unz are using interdependence and mentioning family systems, but you could also be just as easily talking about linked lives and the life course perspective. Okay, so a few slides related to gender before we jump into more on specifically related to romantic relationships. So one of the findings, or one of the phenomena that affects romantic relationships in later adulthood is just the differences in life expectancy by gender. So on average, women around the world live about 5 years longer. This is across all species, not just humans, and this is due to a couple of factors. One is due to X-linked recessive inheritance. So you may have learned about that with genetics, but because males are XY and females are XX, if males get the gene for a disorder on their only X, then they don't have a counterpart gene on another X to cancel it out, and that means they're going to get the disorder. So that's a big factor in why males across the lifespan, across all species, have more disorders. And then the second one is environmental. Males take more risks and generally are less healthy in terms of lifestyle than females. So what this means is that by the time we get to late adulthood, women outnumber men, and by the time we get to being, for example, over 85, it's 2 to 1. And then another bit, in addition to the life expectancy piece, is related to romantic relationships, is what's called age hypergamy. Hypergamy means basically marrying outside of your level, so it could mean like your social status, your caste, if you were in traditional Indian societies. But for age, it means marrying someone of a different age than you. And so we have a standard across cultures that it's more acceptable and then actually more common for heterosexual men to marry a younger woman and heterosexual women to marry a younger man. So then what this translates into is, as you get older, for heterosexual men, their dating pool is endless, right? There's always younger women coming along. But if you're a heterosexual woman, your dating pool is dying off at a rapid rate if you're trying to marry someone your age or older. So because of gender differences in life expectancy and age hypergamy, older women, basically, as we read throughout Karen Unz, are less likely than older men to be married, remarried, cohabiting, or dating. So basically less likely to be in a relationship at all. And this is because the majority of women are heterosexual, and the research doesn't necessarily in all of these areas tease out between lesbian women and heterosexual women. So less likely to be in a relationship at all, more likely to be widowed, twice as likely to be living alone, but thankfully more likely to be alive. And hopefully in future years we'll see that some of this data kind of teased out in terms of whether or not a woman is heterosexual or lesbian. And then of course the opposite would be true for men, that they are more likely to be married, remarried, cohabiting, or dating, less likely to be widowed, less likely to be living alone, but also more likely to not be, more likely to have died. All right, so let's take a look, continuing with this idea of gender, of what the older adult living arrangements are. And this gives us a sense of just older adults in general, and then also specific to gender. So we can see that between ages 65 and 84, we have a fairly small percentage in some sort of nursing home or assisted living. This number is declining. And then we have small kind of single-digit numbers in people in unmarried or living with other family or non-family. From what I can tell in reading this graph, this would involve cohabiting individuals, which seems to be of all kind of older adults, maybe in the 4 to 5% range. When you look at who's in a relationship, then that number goes up a little bit more. I think it might be in the teens. Then the next bar there is unmarried, living with your own children. And the biggest section for both men and women is living with a spouse, so married. And then the kind of bottom numbers are around living alone. So that gives us a sense of trends and who older adults are living with. The Pew Research did note that you could be living with a spouse and with other family members too. So I think those are, included. You could be in a couple of different categories. Some interesting trends here, though, related to gender, right, are that women are more likely, twice as likely at least, if not maybe 3 times as likely, to be living with their own children than men are. Women are not quite half as likely to be married, right, and living with a spouse, but you can see those numbers are significantly higher for men. And women are about twice as likely to be living alone compared to men. Cohabiting or living with other non-family members rates are somewhat comparable, especially by the time we get to 2014, and that could include friends or romantic partners. All right, so let's get more into some relationship forms. All right, so marriage during late adulthood. Basically, if you have stayed married this long, then you've pretty much got you're much more likely to have high marital satisfaction. Now, we all know people who have been married a long time and aren't happy, but a lot of those people have self-selected out of marriage into divorce at this point. We also know, in terms of kind of the stress processes model, that which occurs in a lot of domains, but basically, all the kinds of chronic and acute stressors that we can experience in late adulthood or in later life, certainly we know affect our well-being, our mental health, kind of our physical functioning, what we can do on a daily basis. But this is moderated by our relationship quality. So if we are experiencing chronic or acute stressors, maybe say health issues, and we have supportive partners, then we're less likely to be depressed and we're more likely to have kind of higher activities of daily living. But if we have chronic or acute stressors, our health isn't doing well, and we have poor, marital quality, then we are maybe more likely to struggle in terms of our psychological or physical well-being. Interestingly, basically, women seem to be more sensitive in this, and as an example of interdependence, in these interdependent relationships. Heterosexual wives are more affected by their husband's health problems than husbands are by their wives' health problems. And marital quality seems to have a greater effect on women's health than it does for men. So gender might actually moderate the moderating effect, of relationship quality. Talking about sexuality, and this could be in marriage or cohabitation or dating relationships, lots of variation, right, in sexual activity. Some people in later life are remaining sexually active, some people aren't. Perhaps maybe even more variation than when people are younger. Sexual activity is correlated with mental and physical health, so if you're feeling, less depressed and physically healthier, then you're more likely to be having sex. Overall, though, sexual activity is declining, but, in later life, and sexual satisfaction is lower. But the good news is sexual satisfaction has basically less power in predicting your life satisfaction. So it matters less in how happy you are in life than it did when you were younger. Hormonal changes certainly happening for both males and females. About a third of American women in midlife are needing hormonal assistance with sexuality in terms of vaginal lubrication. And so that can be oral hormones or it could be topical creams. And by age 60, about half of American men are struggling with typically erectile dysfunction at various times. Okay, so now let's talk more about divorce. So I think we've talked already in this class that the divorce rate is, fairly stable or declining sometimes, except for some special populations, including older adults. So gray divorce has roughly doubled over the last 2.5 years. As this age group kind of gets over the stigma around divorce, they're the slowest to kind of get rid of that stigma and pursue divorce. So the negatives of getting divorced in older adulthood are, the risks of loneliness and concerns about finances. The positives are, happiness, feeling free or liberated from maybe unpleasant living situations and having greater independence, not having to, plan your life around what other people, your, spouse wanted to do. This is typical. These last two findings for women and men are typical for women and men across the lifespan. So people getting divorced at younger ages too. Women generally pay a higher financial penalty, so their standard of living is much more likely to decline than men's. And this is, based on heterosexual couple data, because women are less likely to have had as high earning power, pensions, gained Social Security, 401ks, those kinds of things. May not be working and earning as much. And men generally pay a higher social penalty because in heterosexual couples, men have often been relying on their wives and to make kind of those and maintain those social contacts. Okay, talking more about cohabitation. So cohabitation is also increasing for older adults, but still you can see that they are the least likely to be cohabiting, even if their numbers are going up. Among middle and older adult cohabitators, cohabitators are most likely to be divorced. You can see from the graph there. Next would be never married, some widowed, some separated. Generally, the psychological benefits for being in a cohabiting relationship, like how it helps you feel less depressed, less lonely, happier, are similar for those in marriages. And there are noted to be some unique benefits, especially in older adulthood for cohabiting, in that you have separate finances. So you're not having to manage kind of challenging inheritances related to both sets of kids. You also, if you were previously married and your spouse died, you still have access to their pensions, their Social Security if you don't remarry. And if you're a heterosexual female, being in a cohabiting relationship seems to connote less caregiving expectations, kind of less those rigid gender roles that you need to be taking care of your spouse. And so you may not feel like you have to do a lot of as much intensive caregiving. All right, let's talk about widowhood. Obviously, happening for a lot of people in older adulthood. Pretty much everybody who is an older adult and is married, at least one person in that union is going to experience widowhood. And women are more likely to experience it than men. The challenges, of course, are around grief or a sense of depression, and we won't get into kind of the differences and the similarities between grief and depression at this point. We also know that experiencing a significant loss puts you at increased risk for your own health, especially in the year immediately following that loss. You're more likely to have small and big illnesses, more risk for loneliness. Significant buffers in widowhood are relationships. So we're back we're back to interdependence. Obviously, experience of widowhood is about the loss of someone significant, so that is interdependence. And then people seeking family, friendship, community involvement, that's about interdependence too, as a way to cope. The research suggests that most widowers and widows return to their pre-loss kind of emotional well-being within about 2 years. But it's important to keep in mind that, across all types of losses, but particularly the death of a spouse, you can have a continuing bond with them, right? You can keep pictures up with them, you can think about them, you could talk to them, talk about them. You could continue to have kind of a relationship or a connection with them even though they have died. And then lifelong singlehood. So these are people who are also called never married, right? It's fairly rare to go your entire life not being married, although you may be and you may know other people. But as of 2016, only about 5% of adults over the age of 65 have never been married. For women, we're back to kind of gender differences here. Women who are single and have always been single have similar, basically, mental and physical well-being as married women, basically because women are socialized to seek out more meaningful relationships with family and friends. Again, that idea of interdependence, right? And men on average have lower mental and physical health compared to married men due to maybe having less meaningful relationships. And also, it seems like men who are single are slightly different sometimes than women who are single. As best I can understand, they're more likely to have less money and be kind of less socially desirable. So then that kind of compounds the effects of their singlehood. But regardless of gender, all never married older adults are more at risk for poverty because, of course, you are relying on only one income, you have access to only one set of Social Security, only one retirement. And it's the correlation between marriage now and income and education. So people who are more likely to be married are more likely to have higher education and then higher income. So if you are unmarried, that already correlates with lower SES.